My name is Maureen Baehr, and I'm here with Benji Bernstein and Ben Kickert. And our fourth partner is Kenneth Blake, who is not with us today, but has been very instrumental in working on both this app and the work that Ben will be presenting on Thursday. So just a tiny bit of background about me. I am a Wolfram hobbyist for about 10 years. Hobbyist means that I have found two people who can code better than me now, but I can still manage it as a manager of what it is that we're looking to do. And that's one of the things I love about Wolfram. I am post-corporate, organization and strategy, both as a consultant and in-house at American Express for many years. I love Wolfram because it can glue anything together, and it does not make me have to use a lot of different kinds of software and applications. I've been working on two different projects in the philanthropic space, the broad philanthropic space. I think social impact would be a better way to put it. And we're going to present one today and one on Thursday. The one that we'll be presenting on Thursday is about the Sustainable Development Goals and how to use Wolfram and the full Wolfram stack, or a lot of it, as glue to tie together a lot of disparate things that are existing out in the world of data around the Sustainable Development Goals. When I was here 3 years ago, I started talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a 15-year project of the UN and the world to try to make the world better. And among others, John Keel, who's here today, was very encouraging. I had a great presentation that said I would be back in a year with a whole lot done. And I'm back in 3 years, and we didn't do half of it, but we did a lot. And we also came up with a second business area that we wanted to look at, in philanthropic area. You've probably heard the phrase impact investment. Impact investment is the idea that you can do social impact, have social impact, and get a reasonable financial return. We started an organization called Starting Up Good about 5 years ago. Cadet and I started it. It's a pro bono organization working with startups to help them figure out how to incorporate social impact into their startup models. We did a lot of Silicon Valley conferences, and we were preaching to the non-converted at that point. The VC model was in full bloom at that point. So they would say, that's cool, and we're going to do what the VCs tell us to do. Over the past 5 years, what we've seen is a lot of demand for investments that have both social impact return and financial return. So we're not talking philanthropy here, we're talking real investments. Just to give you a sense of the sizing, it's increased 25-fold from 2013 to 2017 in terms of assets under management. So what we decided is the startups are listening a little bit more now. There are multiple models for how to get startup money, and the impact investing model is holding its own, actually. There's a lot of new investors who are interested in investing in startups that have social impact. And that's not necessarily because they're philanthropic, it's because more and more of their own investors are looking for, endowments are looking for, private equity investors are looking for things that have decent social impact return as well. So based on that, we decided to start to build, we're calling it an app, but it's really more formative than an app at this point, a way to gather the information that is, and the data that is starting to exist around impact investing, and put it all into one place using Wolfram as our glue, and start to look at it and see what are the things that are making impact investors decide to go with certain startups and not with others. So what you're going to see today from Benji is some of our work in it. What you'll also see is that it's very formative in a lot of different ways. The primary one, some of it is because we're still learning, but also the data is brand new. there were not giant impact investing databases before. And what that means, because the field is burgeoning, is everybody's inventing their own. You'll see on Thursday that the UN sort of sets the stage for most of the Sustainable Development Goal stuff. So it's much more standardized in terms of data. In the impact space, we're working with 4 different databases that have begun. Some of them have been around for a couple of years, some of them are pretty brand new, and trying to figure out how to normalize them using Wolfram to do that, to build a macro database that will then allow startups to start to explore impact investing possibilities and what they might do as a startup to model their companies in ways that are attractive to impact investors. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Benji, and thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Maureen, for the intro. So just moving on to this next slide, Maureen just touched on it a bit, but basically this is a very burgeoning and new space, and because of that, a lot of the data that's being set up is really structured in all sorts of different ways. So when it came to really starting to put this app together, obviously the first thing that we needed was a real and large data set and data sort to be able to use to actually inform the analytics and analysis happening within the app form. So basically, the 4 different companies that we looked at that are all playing in the impact investment space in some way that Maureen alluded to earlier are Impact Space, B Corp, Gin, and Crunchbase. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to show you most of the data that we had around the impact space data source, just because that tends to be the most robust source within the impact investing field right now in terms of the deals, the investors and the companies all being structured neatly together. So as I'm sure all of you know, cleaning and parsing is not easy, specifically when you have unstructured data that's coming in and it's new. So obviously, one of the things that we spent a lot of our time doing in the beginning of this process was really working with some of the capabilities within Wolfram to actually download, extract, and then clean and parse the data. So using a variety of different string manipulation functions that are built into Wolfram. Here you'll see a little snippet of code of just the import. Obviously, we have a lot more code that deals with all of the ways that we cleaned and structured this data originally. But this was definitely something that we spent a bulk of our time doing in the early stages of this app's development. So moving on here, it's the wrong way. Moving on here, we've heard some about entity stores during Stephen Wolfram's keynote last night. He talked about it, I think, at some of the other sessions today. People have mentioned it and their utility as well. And we always saw them as something from the beginning that we wanted to make a big part of this process. So after we actually successfully downloaded all of this data and structured it, we wanted to then transition it over into the entity store structure so that we could be actually working with our own internal entity store within Wolfram for linking throughout our app. And so some of the reasons that we use an entity store are up here. Obviously, they give you this very easy and natural ability to link between different data sets, to actually integrate Wolfram entities as well as your own entities that you define into existing data sets that you download, ability to build in interpreters. Again, they have that simplified built-in data visualization structure. And then sort of lastly, well, actually these 2 pieces here together, ultimately we'll want to be able to call in and link to some of the built-in Wolfram entities that already exist, as they'll be relevant in different ways to the app that we're developing. And then finally, because they're just easy to convert, it's easy to combine and recombine and append new data to entity stores. And we found that it was actually better than other structures within Wolfram to use. And so what you'll see here are some defined functions that we actually built. And just before I get into explaining them a little bit, one of the things that we saw was that we were really used to analyzing data through the dataset format within Wolfram. And we saw very early on, as we started to explore the entity store format, that there were really different advantages to both the entity stores as well as to the data sets. And so we wanted to create sort of these quick defined functions that we would be able to use throughout the app's development to be able to turn data sets into entity stores and then turn them back. And then that was all before we heard Stephen Wolfram's keynote last night, where he said that that is going to be something built in basically into version 12. So we did all this work, and hopefully it'll still be the good use, but we'll definitely be using that. Yeah. Yeah, so currently it's being used internally, and we'll get into that, how we're using it exactly. We have actually 10 clients that we've been sort of testing it out with. They've been helping us develop it based on their own unique needs. And then sort of after we finish this test phase, the idea will be to then move into getting it ready to be industrial strength and actually modified to be public facing. So just moving on here, to creating the actual app form structure. So let me just reiterate what my colleague Maureen was saying at the beginning of the presentation. So really, there's all these different great data sources that are available right now in the impact investing space, but because it's such a new space, we weren't really seeing that there was any real analysis being done on this data in a uniquely concise way that any startup looking to get into the space could just access to be able to actually have new information about what would potentially be attractive to impact investors. So we wanted to really meet this need that we saw within the sector there. So again, the idea is to create a platform where startups can conveniently and easily input information about their own company and then receive an actual report output from this form that we're about to show you that includes really similar peer startups. So whether that be in terms of their industry, overlapping, geographies, social and environmental objectives, or even, getting very granular to their actual business functions and models, we really want to be able to provide them with a tool where they can access different startups that have successfully received impact investment who are very akin to what they do. So in terms of the implementation, I already touched on this based on your question, but this is sort of what we're calling the version 1 master form, and it's a long form that I'll take you through very quickly. But basically the idea centers around a customized weighting system that uses algorithmic string matching functions, and I'll explain those a little bit more in detail as we go through. As I mentioned before, we're using version 1 with this pilot group of those 10 clients to really just tailor it as best to their needs and to what they say is most important to them as people coming into the space and looking for impact investment. And then again, this long form will be modified as we continue to move forward in the development process here. So if I'll just take you through a quick example, I'm actually haven't asked for permission to do this from one of our clients, but I'm going to use them as a case study here for how the form actually works. Made Meals is a company that is doing really interesting things and is really positioning themselves right now to actually be attractive to impact investors. And so what they do is they're basically a farm-to-table app that pairs local farmers with consumers who want a more healthy lifestyle and actually delivers fresh produce to these consumers to be able to allow them with convenience to have a healthier diet. So essentially that's the main idea. One other thing that they do in their business model is that they're really focused on hiring formerly incarcerated individuals for their business model. They're focused on also meeting that other social objective of helping with re-entry for people who have a hard time finding jobs after they've been incarcerated. So really you can see with a company like this, they have multiple different social objectives, environmental objectives all in one. And this is sort of an interesting case that we think is kind of a micro example of a lot of what we're seeing in the impact investing space, and these are the types of companies within it. So anyway, within the form, put in the company name, so Made Meals, as I just said, and then there's all sorts of different fields with drop downs. So I'll skip over the first couple, just as an example, I'll show the industry. So right here, there's an industry, and we have a drop down, it's long, but it actually links to all of the different industry options within the impact space data source. So if Made Meals, for instance, says, okay, we're in the agriculture business, that's great. They're in the agriculture business. That being said, we don't know how much that's relevant to the particular user startup, and that needs to be up to their discretion to tell us. So if agriculture is sort of their main industry, then they have this option to weight it at a particularly high level. And so they can actually right now enter any type of weight that they want. We're ultimately going to try to streamline it to be just a set of options, potentially 0 through 3, where they can pick the strongest weight. And then what happens is that field is then run against the entity store of all of the different companies within that entity store that have an industry of agriculture. So every time a company with agriculture as one of their industries is found within our entity store, the weight that the user assigns is then added on to what becomes a cumulative total for the particular user company using our form. And so the idea here is that, okay, so I weight industry 1 agriculture and I weight it with a 3. That's my top weight for me as the user. And then I go down and then get here to social objectives. I'm just skipping over some of the other ones just to show you the example. I get to social objectives, health improvement based on our conversations with the Made Meals founder. That's their number 1 social objective, okay? So if I'm him, I'll weight this then as a 3 as the top weight. Food security, that's another one, very important as well. I'll weight that as a 3. And then, like I said before, you're working, on re-entry programs for formerly incarcerated individuals. So this other social objective of equality and empowerment of minorities or previously excluded populations, that's something as well that I'd like to include. It just doesn't happen to be the main social objective, so maybe I'll weight that as a 2 rather than a 3. So again, this is all run through that string matching function against all the companies within the entity stores, against all of their corresponding social objectives, and then each time one of these different entries is found, the corresponding weight is then added to the total. So you go through, again, you have environmental objectives, sustainable land use. That's something for Made Meals that would be relevant to them. Natural resource conservation, you could say that that's relevant. And so they would go through, and then finally they would get to this keyword category. And based on our initial testing of this app form, this tends to be the most important category because this is what really allows the startup to get into that level of granularity where they're able to really distinguish themselves and what it is that they do specifically and differently from the field. And so Made Meals, obviously, we look at their company overview when we do this, but this will be up to the company user to determine based on their own discretion. Meals is something that's important in the business model. Ingredients, words like incarcerated, organic, those are all things that we'll put in here and then weight at the highest weight. And then you get to this last field where you see the number of companies to return. The default is 20. So let's say we just go with the default and we press OK. And then we get to this output of the top weighted peers. And so just from eyeballing, you can see by this output, Mayoko's Kitchen, Mindful Meats, that sounds very similar to Made Meals, and just look at some of these in-farm Biocore, you already start to see that they are probably very good matches to Made Meals, and then their weighted totals are all next to them, and the way that the algorithm is working, it's ranking them in order of their weighted totals. So within the app concept, we're not going to show you everything interactively right now. As Maureen mentioned, it's formative, and there's a lot of different things that you can do with the entity store structure that we're using, but users can then click on these different companies and see interactively, which ones of them have received impact investment in the past and who they've received the investment from. So then they can start to look into the different investors that have given to these similar companies to them. This is something that we're going to continue to build out and figure out how to automate in a way that's really actionable for them, but that's within this current initial version. And then just getting down here, you see this little screenshot. You're also able to export all of the output data on each of the top weighted companies that are returned into a CSV file. And so here's just a screenshot of that. And you see all of these same companies above, but now pulling their entity store data within our entity store and then putting it into that CSV file here. So that's that part. And I'll just move on very quickly here. So applying machine learning, that's something that we're ultimately trying to do with this app concept. Obviously, algorithmically, we have it working. It's effective. We've tested it with startup users, and we're happy with the results, and so are they. That being said, we want to actually get to the point where we can predict or recommend the highest probability funders for each user startup using, again, this finely tuned classifier function that Wolfram allows us to use, trained on data that is highly integrated from across these different sources that we've mentioned. And so the steps, just to run through them quickly, because I know we're running short on time here, but extracting, structuring, and storing a large enough data set from multiple sources. This is something we've already done, and so we're pretty confident in our ability to continue to be able to do this. Next is building a classifier function or set of functions to begin to actually integrate company data from the different data sources that we're using all into the singular entity store that will sort of serve as the foundation of this app. I'll get into that a little bit later. Third is to really build that classifier function through a set of trained impact investor data from our entity stores where, like I mentioned before, investors will actually be trained on the company overviews along with some of the other fields of their investment companies or of the companies that they're actually investing in. We're going to then test, obviously, the classifier functions that we're building on new sets of test data. And then ultimately, the final step will really be to be able to provide startups with their strongest funding opportunities, including the associated probabilities of funders being strong matches or the best possible options for what they're doing. The results so far, just getting into this section here. So as I mentioned before, one of the things we're trying to do is use the machine learning capabilities within Wolfram to integrate data from different sources. We've actually already begun training and testing a classifier function that helps integrate and assign companies from external data sources. And the early results are actually very positive. And we have just a little screenshot here of us running the classifier function on an overview of a company from a different data source. This case is B Corp. And from the overview, it's able to say, it's called Buddy Media. It's a social enterprise software company, empowering those to build and maintain relationships with their consumers. And so what we're seeing here is that it's actually assigning this as access to information with a very high probability. Obviously, it needs to be tweaked and tested stronger, but it is an exciting development. Additionally, we also want to begin to train the data on the impact investors and the overviews that we mentioned a little bit earlier. So this brings us then to our final slide here, which is our challenges and opportunities section. And so as you saw from our app form, user interfacing, obviously going to be a challenge for us ahead, but also a strong opportunity for us. So we want to really continue tweaking the interface specifically so that the numerical weighting system becomes more executed more heavily in the back end rather than potentially by the user themselves so that it's just easier to use in all areas. We want to experiment with different types of user-facing or internal algorithmic weightings to fine-tune machine learning training sets. We're going to, like I said before, the ultimate goal is to build out an automated report template so that you're not just getting sort of a data set or an Excel spreadsheet with all of the peers, but you're actually getting actionable results in a report as your output after using the app. And then again, developing an automated system to actually update our entity stores on a regular basis so that we're staying up to date with all of the impact investment data that's currently out there. When it comes to machine learning, we just went through a lot of that. We're already sort of meeting this first bullet point here, using Wolfram machine learning to integrate additional data sources. One other thing that we're going to do, and my colleague Ben, as well as Maureen, will talk about this more in our presentation tomorrow, but we're going to want to actually create some machine learning classifier functions tailored specifically to the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as we found in our work that those also help companies attract impact investors. And then again, these are sort of the last two major opportunities that are probably longer down the road here. But ultimately, what we want to be able to do is identify the core areas of strength in successful companies, whether it's their website content, their social media content, business structure, social objectives, to provide actionable recommendations to improve impact investment positioning for client companies, doing automated analysis of all of those same fields. So again, website content, social media, and what have you. And then lastly here, just creating a system to automatically track the impact investment progress of startup users over time will be something that we're looking to do as well so that we can actually begin to measure the efficacy of our app form here. And Maureen, I don't know if you
I just wanted to repeat why we love Wolfram. The data is formative. We're finding that different databases have different kinds of descriptions of things that will be relatable once we figure out how to relate them. We were at the neural network repository session this morning, and we saw probably 3 different neural networks and ways to train that are going to help us get these classifiers better. As the field emerges, we expect that Wolfram and we are moving in parallel in certain ways. So we're looking forward to, it was exciting actually to hear Stephen Wolfram last night say that something is going to be incorporated that we sort of have embedded in our sort of homebrewed version. And we also think that a lot of the data that we're gathering will have some robustness for the overall Wolfram repositories over time. So we're gathering sort of a new dimension of data for companies and financials in this, and for SDGs and World Bank data and things in that. So we're very excited to be playing this game. We expect this isn't going to be finished anytime soon. We don't see it as needing to be finished because Wolfram was pretty good at being iterative as well.